All right, let's get started. Welcome to SmartOrg's webinar, Accelerating Innovation-Driven Growth. It's with Henry Bryndza, who is Global Technology Director at DuPont, and David Matheson, CEO of SmartOrg. A little bit about SmartOrg. SmartOrg's portfolio evaluation platform helps companies align on the questions of where and how much to invest and how to drive the upside. Our customers typically see improvements of 30 to 50% or more in the return on their growth investments. We provide software and consulting services to that end. This is part of a webinar series on strategic portfolio management. We bring in clients who own the portfolio process at their respective companies, as well as other thought leaders. And recent installments that you can find on our website include Rogers Corporation, Teva Pharmaceuticals, and Nature Conservancy. And during this webinar, please turn on your computer speakers during the presentation. Enter questions into the GoToWebinar questions box. We will handle those at the end of the Q&A. And do participate in the polls. So first, quick poll as a test, and to let us know about you. Please select one. Are you a participant in the portfolio process? Do you own the portfolio process at your organization? Are you an executive accountable for growth in your organization? Are you a consultant or vendor in this space, or some other capacity? Please vote now. We'll keep that poll open for about 20 seconds. Okay. And there's the result of the poll. So let's move on, and I will introduce David Matheson, the CEO of SmartOrg. President and CEO. And over to you, David.
Thank you, Stuart. I'm David Matheson, President and CEO of SmartOrg, and I'm delighted to be here and to welcome you to this webinar. I have a lot of experience working in portfolio management innovation. But mostly what you need to know about me is my favorite food is chocolate, and if I had some, I would be sure to hand it out. So let's move on with the content. I see a lot of companies, and perhaps you find yourself in this kind of situation, represented by this sort of metaphorical picture of needing to drive new growth. Somehow, you're all with successful companies, and the way you've been doing things just isn't kind of producing the results you want. So you feel you need to shift gears or accelerate or somehow drive more growth out of the company. So this is quite a common challenge among many companies. And what I've observed is that growth strategies seem to fall into two broad buckets. So one I would call the exploit strategy. And this is basically, we have what we have, and we're going to squeeze a little more juice out of the lemon. So the innovation here tends to be fairly incremental. The logic or thinking or emphasis tends to be inside out. That is, I start with my assets and what I have, and then I push and see like how in the world, what in the world can I address? But it sort of starts with you, the company, and pushes outwards to think about how you might impact it. It tends to build on success, current customers, current business processes, current markets, places you've been successful, and sort of turn up the heat on those things. And the kind of underlying assumption is a reliable delivery. I'm gonna make a promise that I can probably deliver on pretty reliably, and I'm going to drive growth through that. Now, this is a fabulous growth strategy to exploit what you have, and I really couldn't argue with it, except to say that it's not the only growth strategy. So many companies want to be known in the industry or by Wall Street as a growth company. And usually what they mean when they talk about a growth company as kind of from a Wall Street point of view, is somebody who's pursuing the growth strategy I would call create. So this is about getting out of the current way of doing things and defining something new, what sometimes has been called blue ocean strategy. So how do you make that leap? So here the innovation tends to be bolder. The emphasis is reversed. It's not from you outwards, it's from the world back to you. So if you identify big needs, big problems, and you figure out what is it going to take to solve them, and the answer may be, of course, you only have a small role to play, but you go figure that out and connect the dots and deliver a solution. So the focus is on the need and the problems out in the world, and these are generally high-risky investments, so fundamentally you end up playing the odds. Reliable delivery is not what this is about. It's about trying the crazy, the great, the new, and a few of them work. And the thing about this is that you want to really swing for the fences, so if one of them works, it's fabulous. And as an example of this kind of company, you could think of Amazon as fundamentally having this strategy. They try a lot of stuff, and every once in a while they come up with something like AWS, and it changes everything. So that's the create strategy. And so just to kind of warm you guys up, let's do a poll about this. If you think about your company, where do you think you need to most improve your growth portfolio? Real companies actually do a combination of this, but typically driving growth requires sort of whipping the horses harder on let's exploit more, or it involves getting out of what we've been doing in the past, dialing that back a little bit, and really driving creation of the new and the wild and the wonderful. So I can see most folks have voted. We'll leave the poll open just for another moment. Get your last minute vote in here. And okay, I'm going to close the poll and share it. So here you can see the results. 9% of the audience needs to get better at exploiting. That's good, that's solid. 82% of the audience needs to get better at creation as a growth strategy, and 9% is happy with where they are. So that's fantastic. This is a great strategy, or a great finding. I think many companies aspire to do more with creation as part of their growth strategy, but in fact their behaviors and their history are really around exploit. So as companies develop and grow, they do more and more exploit, and eventually that sort of runs down, produces fewer returns, and they need to create. But then how do you steer that ship into a new area and find renewal and go to the next level? Well, we've got with us Henry Bryndza, who is involved in the merger of the century, a galactic level merger. Dow and DuPont are coming together. Both are successful companies with long, great histories. They're galaxies into themselves, and they're merging, and they're spinning off new parts. And both of them have histories of very successful exploit strategies, and their deep history is, they're both founded on creation, probably decades ago. So how do you steer this ship in a complicated merger and really shift gears to get renewal and forge a growth company out of two companies that are excellent at exploitation with a history actually of creation? So that's what we've got. The man who was there, who helped make it happen, Henry Bryndza. His professional experience is awesome. He's been working this area almost as long as he's been married. And as you can see here, both for about almost 40 years. And he's been involved in adding breakout and disruptive innovation to strong base portfolios. And you can see his 4 very hairy children there. So I also have, I have 2 dogs, not 4, but we share that. So with that, let me turn it over to Henry for his remarks on how Dow and DuPont addressed this issue and forged a new growth company. So Henry, take it away.
Great, thank you, David. Yeah, you can just go to the first slide. What I thought I would do today is give you a really quick amplification of what David just explained in terms of the Dow DuPont company, and then launch into the work that we've been doing and why. and I know we'll have some opportunity for Q&A. Happy to try and address any of that I can. To start then, David was correct. Alan DuPont had been on a 3-year odyssey with a major milestone reached in September of 2017, where regulatory approvals were granted and the two companies merged. The portfolio work in terms of shifting businesses has been underway since then to create 3 new pure play companies that are world-class in their spaces, and the intention is to spin the first of those, the materials company, which will be called Dow, on April 1st of this year, followed by a split of Corteva, a pure play ag company, from a specialty products company, which will retain the DuPont name, on June 1st. So that's where we are, and if you go to the next chart, we're going to be talking about the specialty products company and, in fact, the safety and construction business within it. But there are 4 reporting segments to the new DuPont, one of them electronics and imaging, another nutrition and biosciences, and a third transportation and advanced polymers, in addition to safety and construction, which we call S&C. The numbers here reflect the 2017 revenues, and I think we report full 2018 revenues and earnings on Thursday, so stay tuned. They'll be bigger than 2017, I can reliably expect, without divulging anything. The next chart just talks about safety and construction a bit more, and that is the business is organized into 5 lines of business. They contain some of DuPont's most well-known brands, although I'm the first to recognize that DuPont is primarily a B2B company and not a B2C company, so it's hardly a household name for a lot of you, I'm expecting. But perhaps you might have heard of some of the brands. In our aramids business, there's Kevlar and Nomex, ultra-high performance fibers that are probably best known for things like ballistic vests and race gear for race car drivers, thermal protection for race car drivers, but they're also used in ultra-high performance composites, as well as pretty much every motor insulation on the new e-vehicles contains some Nomex. There's a Korean design business that does actually have a retail footprint and makes countertops, but as well as a number of other surfaces for different types of interiors and exteriors of buildings. There's a Performance Building Solutions that contains the former Dow styrofoam and Great Stuff businesses, as well as the Tyvek house wrap. There's a Tyvek business that makes protective apparel, medical packaging, and other types of consumer protection products. And finally, there's a water business that has reverse osmosis, ultrafiltration, and ion exchange as part of its makeup. If you go to the next chart, these are pretty big businesses, as the $5 billion 2017 revenues might imply. Each one is, on the order of $1 billion, $1.5 billion, and in terms of revenues. And we are pretty proud of some of the ways these materials are used today. For example, 200 million people a year protected from everything ranging from dirt to Ebola by Tyvek garments. Every minute, there's about 25 million gallons of water purified by our reverse osmosis membranes. If you've flown on a plane recently, you've ridden on Kevlar and Nomex honeycomb composites. 100% of commercial airliners use them, both in the interiors as well as in some control surfaces. 250,000 homes a year are either designed and built or renovated with Korean countertops. Over 5 million soldiers and police officers are protected with new body armor made of Kevlar every year. And if you live in an average house in the U.S., you probably have half a mile of gaps and cracks that could benefit and should be sealed with Great Stuff thermal insulation to make your house both more energy efficient and more comfortable. So that's a little bit about who we are. And so the natural question is, okay, so what's the issue? Well, if you go to the next one, David, I think the issue is that the business has been called upon as part of a conglomerate to be generating cash to support the growth in the ag business, and it's largely been moving forward by incremental exploitation of disruptive inventions that were made 30 to 50 years ago, sort of the squeeze the lemon mission that David outlined. And as part of a high growth, innovation-based specialty products company, that's not, excuse me, what the business is required to do going forward. And yet with both that orientation and also the fact that these highly successful businesses have attracted competition, more and more effort has to go into protecting against new entrants, and so replacement revenues and continued incremental innovation is necessary. But that really means that what we have to do is exactly what's shown on this slide, which is to put, excuse me, the safety and construction business into a new gear to basically move it from the base hits to a more balanced combination of growth and exploit portfolios, so that it has higher risk reward overall, goes from predictable incremental growth to creating options and driving the upside of its technologies from being systematic and if you will say predictable about innovation to being more agile and quick moving, to go from being really a technology forward to a market back and partner with customers to win standpoint. And that's really what we've been working on for the last 18 months. And on the next chart, you can see where we are today. And that's a mixture of different types of business models. To be sure, we continue to operate what we think is among the world's best application development engines for incremental growth, where we run the design, build, test, analyze cycle as efficiently and effectively as we think anybody in the business. But we've added to that a new business development and also breakout growth innovation within our lines of business, where we go after high growth markets that have good margin dynamics, where our competencies can be brought to bear to solve important problems. And that's the fundamental change that we have made. And if you go to the next chart, it's very consistent with the specialty companies, the new DuPont's mission, which is high growth by making strategically aligned choices, executing impeccably, and learning from that so that we get better and we continue to lather, rinse, repeat, as the saying goes. We're getting some help from the structure of the corporation in that it's got a very lean corporate core, which means very low overheads and very fast decision making. So that's both helping us in the shift that we're making from a cultural point of view. So how have we approached this? Well, I'm going to be speaking mostly about the first of those boxes, which is making choices. And if you go to the next one, I think it really all starts with strategy. There are lots of different ways of, I know, approaching business strategies, but the most important thing is that you have one and that it's robust. I happen to like the playing to win framework that Roger Martin has articulated, because then it gets really clear. Strategy is never easy, but at least this one is clear, and it forces you to go up and down the cascade to make sure that everything is internally consistent. And our businesses had to start here because really they needed to shift strategies as a starting point. And that means starting with the aspirations, which were well spelled out by our corporation, but then figuring out where we're going to play, how we're going to win, and what kind of capabilities we need to have and how we're going to manage the whole thing to make sure that we could actually meet those aspirations. And certainly technology status, what might be possible from technology in terms of growth was part of that, but it all starts with business strategy. And then we've constructed a technology strategy for each of these, for the safety and construction business, as well as each of the lines of business that meet up with the business strategies. And again, I don't work for Roger Martin. I think there are a number of frameworks that work, but this one I'll just tell you what's worked for us and what we've tried. The other thing that we have done is taken the where to play and how to win dimensions. And keep in mind, there are really only a couple of those for each of the businesses. But those are the things that are really critical to be able to delivering on our aspiration. And we've plotted those against time in technology roadmaps. And so each one is a vector. The bottom right chart is just an example of a template that we fill in with the actual programs in each of those areas. And this allows us to do a number of things. First of all, it forces us to say, you know, is everything that we're doing aligned with strategy? And sadly, not everything necessarily was, which begs the question, well, okay, you either ought to stop that or you ought to figure out what's wrong with your strategy. So that was helpful. The other thing is that it obviously allows you to test, is this new idea aligned with strategy before you ever do anything? And that's helping us to keep focus and make choices on what's strategically important rather than what's opportunistically in front of us. The other thing that's more nuanced, but probably very much more important, is taking the existing portfolio and looking at it and saying, okay, do I have some of these dimensions where I'm overrepresented? Do I have some where I'm underrepresented? Do I have examples where everything in my pipeline is in the next 18, is going to hit the bottom line in the next 18 months, and I don't really have a long-term pipeline for growth here, and what am I going to do about that? It forces you to make sure that you have balanced pipelines in all of the things that you said are really critical. And I think that's an incredibly important set of steps, and I don't want to undermine it, but it's not enough, because as you can imagine, while it's important that everything we do be aligned with strategy, not everything that's aligned with strategy is worth doing. And so if you go to the next chart, what that really forced us to do was take a look at the resulting portfolio and say, okay, what in this is worth doing, recognizing that it is a work in progress and that we are constantly adding new programs to the portfolio, and we're also seeing programs that either graduate or fail that we have to replace. And so it's a natural living organism, if you will. But that's where we really needed to invest in portfolio strategy. And if you go to the next chart, what we found when we looked at our portfolios, it had a number of systematic problems. The first was low aspirations, and that's more consistent with a mission of cash generation than with growth. And so we really needed to both look at the upside of our programs in our portfolio, as well as to expand our thinking into new areas where they could be brought, where new programs could be brought to bear to have bigger impact. The other problem is that we had significant clutter in our portfolio, lots of little things that were getting in the way of actually focusing on what was most important. And when everything is important, nothing is important. And the last problem in terms of the composition of the portfolio was that it was made up of a lot of wounded projects, and I think that's related to the clutter, because what we were trying to do is do too many things and not staff any of them for success. And so we had low aspirations, clutter, and wounded projects, and to compound all of that, we were using the MOAS system to manage our portfolio, which is to say managing the mother of all spreadsheets to manage our process, and it just flat out didn't work. We couldn't keep it current. We couldn't manage all the variations. We couldn't manage what-if questions or comparisons well. So we had a lot of problems with the portfolio in terms of being able to manage growth. So if we go to the next one, I think we're at a poll now.
Yeah, a poll. So let's just give everyone an opportunity to sort of reflect on the issues that he's described. So there's a poll up, and just what are your top concerns? We've characterized the issues that Henry faced as accelerating growth, uncovering hidden value or driving visibility upside, focusing on what matters or reducing clutter. You could sort of say it either way. Resourcing projects for success, that is, even if you know what's important, they may not actually be getting the resources you need, and aligning on the strategic priorities and better portfolio choices, that link that Henry talked about. So go ahead and vote. I see many of you have. So we're going to give you another 20 seconds or so to finish your voting. Looks like people have stopped voting. Oh, looks few more snuck in there. You got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm closing the polls, and let's share and see what folks say. So we have a tie here, 38% worried about accelerating growth and aligning on strategic priorities or better portfolio choices. So that's a lot of the audience, but those are the top 2 ones. And I think that fits pretty well with what you're talking about, Henry. As part of that, the runners up here are uncovering hidden value or visible upside and focusing on matters or reducing clutter are close seconds to those first 2. And even resourcing projects for success is still strong, even though it's the smallest one with 25%. So I think folks on the phone share the same kinds of issues. Henry, you have any comment or reflection on this result?
Well, it's both a relief that we're not alone, and maybe you'll take some comfort in the fact that there actually are some concrete steps that worked, at least for us, that you might find useful. So I'm hoping that this will prove useful. The rest of the talk will prove useful to you.
Yeah. Let me, before you go again, Henry, let me remind folks that there is a question window on your control panel, and at any time, please go ahead and type in a question and submit it, and we'll try to either work it into the discussion as we go, and at the end, we'll take things with Q&A. So please do. We've got a few questions, but I just want to remind everyone to go ahead and do that. If you have any question at any time, put it into the question window on your control panel. And with that, Henry, let me turn it back over to you with what you did about all this.
Okay, so we set about outlining what we needed in terms of strategic portfolio management, and we decided that rather than having the mother of all spreadsheets and trying to run around and see who had the most current version and try and keep track of all the different project managers and make sure that every project had all the parameters always up to date, what we did is said we really need a relational database that is a parametric tool where we really focus the discussion on how difficult the project is and how big it can be, and let the program calculate the discounted cash flow values, the real option values, and all of the supporting information that might be necessary to make choices. What we did is looked at a lot of options that were out there. And I will tell you, and one of my biases. So first of all, the short answer is we looked at a lot of options and we selected the Portfolio Navigator by SmartOrg. And I don't work for David either, but what I do have a strong bias for is tools that are designed for the job. And what we found when we were looking is that there were an awful lot of what I call Swiss Army knives out there, systems that promise to do everything from strategy and road mapping and portfolio management and project management, and didn't really do any of them very well. And as a result, we're also, in my view, hopelessly complex and needed super users and all of that sort of thing just to keep them fed. And that really wasn't what we wanted. I don't know how many of you have tried to use the scissors or the screwdriver on a Swiss Army knife, and it's really an emergency tool. It's not something that you want to use on a daily basis. So we had a strong bias for selecting, and we had some good tools for strategy. We had some good tools for road mapping and for project management. We really wanted something to help us with portfolio, and we wanted a really good set of screwdrivers, if you will, carrying that analogy forward. And that's what had us gravitate towards the SmartOrg tool. So first of all, it did focus on relatively few inputs, and they were organized around those how difficult and how big the projects can be. And it really forced the project teams to discuss them and to discuss why they would characterize the project that way. It also means that when something changes in a project, it's a simple matter for the project manager who has access to the database to simply change that one parameter, and everything else, not only for that project, but the whole portfolio changes, and it's kept up to date. So in essence, we have what we were looking for, which really was a single source of truth as it comes to our portfolio. So that's where we started. And if you go to the next chart, I figured once we had selected it, we're smart guys and we know how to use software packages. We ought to be able to do this ourselves. We have growth champions for each of our lines of business. And those people are responsible for the portfolio, the growth portfolios in particular in each one of those lines of business. And they went out for training and they came back and said, yeah, you're wrong. We need more help than that. And then they proceeded to explain what we were really going to do, and it made a lot of sense. So we engaged SmartOrg on the consulting side, and they helped walk us through, first of all, entering the data, which was really, again, a conversation among the project teams. Equally important was training the management team on calibrating the portfolio, making sure that all the assumptions that went in were comparable within a line of business and across the lines of business, so you really could make meaningful choices. And then recognizing that we were going to be making major changes, so keeping people on board with what we're doing and why was equally important. So that education process and transparency in the process was really key. We did get walked through the decision making options, and I think again that helped expand our thinking. And then ultimately we're now to the point where we are soloing, and we do get continued requests for SmartOrg to either help us with a special project or deep dive into upside potential on a new concept that we've been working on. But we're largely now soloing, if you want to call it that. And I would say in this process, what amazed me the most, if I can just digress for a minute, is that in part of that training for the management team, SmartOrg uses something called the portfolio game, and it just amazes me. Something that it's a simple Dungeons and Dragons like dice game where it teaches portfolio math to senior business leaders. And I had always assumed this was like MBA 101, but the number of senior leaders that I still have coming back and talking about the portfolio game and the fact that it's cemented for them the importance of going after a balanced portfolio that has a significant fraction, in fact, as much as you can afford, of high risk, high reward programs in it, the more successful you will ultimately be, is a lasting impression. And I never would have expected that, but I'm delighted that it happened. But once all of that happened, it really did allow us in the decision process to say, is the project big enough to matter? Does it represent a productive use of our resources? That's both people and dollars. Is it going to be material to our 5-year plans? Will it meet our 5-year growth aspirations? Does the program adequately balance risk and reward? And these last two items are not only project questions, but portfolio questions. And the tools allow us to ask those questions and get good answers and make decisions on our own. So if you go to the next chart, I'll just give a few examples. Here's one that was aimed at understanding the upside potential of a project. During the calibration process, this is an example from the Corian business that has been developing an ultra-thin, ultra-tough grade of Corian, and they were going after a new application where the customer was looking to replace something that cost them $25 to $40 per unit. And the way the business was approaching, the way the project leader was approaching this was to say, it's probably going to cost us about 25 cents of material to do this, and if we can get 50 cents, boy, that'll be a marvelous margin for this business on this product. So that's what they built into it. And when we looked at it and tried to calibrate the portfolio, we said, gee, we thought this was a much bigger idea than it's turning out to be. Well, we dug in and we found out that we weren't pricing it for value or even targeting it for all of the applications that we should have. And so when we drove the project team to think bigger, to look for the upside in their project, you can see what happened to the expected value. It went from the left-hand set of tornado elements to the right-hand set, and it didn't just increase the value of that project, the potential expected value by 20–30%. It was 10x. And when you look at it, now the downside case of the expected value is bigger than the original expected value of the project. So it made really material changes to force us to think about the project differently, and it all came through the calibration and decision process. So very important. And when you looked at the rest of the Corian portfolio, as just shown on the in the sort of same way in the next chart, you can see that if they had on the order of, I'll call it somewhere 15 to 20 significant projects, they basically had probably 20 to 30% of them that would benefit from that kind of stretch approach. And if you go to the next chart, you can now see kind of a ranked list of expected values within that portfolio. Next one, please, David. And then looking at that, you can, by inspection, you can say, okay, first of all, why are these guys working on anything except the top 6 projects? And secondly, you can see that the upside potential of the top maybe 4 projects are bigger than the entire rest of the expected values, including the ranges of a lot of the other programs that follow. And so it really does beg the question, how can I free up more resources to go after that upside? Now, the answer is also a cautionary one. It's one that says taking one view of a portfolio is like the blind person taking one touch of the elephant, and you're going to get a different view depending upon what part of the elephant you're touching. And in this particular case, some of those little programs at the bottom are small and are never going to have an impact on the business, and they should be stopped. And frankly, they have been stopped. But the doing it mindlessly is the wrong thing to do, because when you look at it, one of the things that will jump out at you as you start to dig into the project is that this is representing the growth potential of the project. It's not representing how much fade it's also fighting. So it doesn't capture effectively the net present value of the do-nothing case, or really the net present cost of the do-nothing case. So again, looking at these kinds of comparisons is very important to making choices, don't get me wrong, but you have to look at multiple dimensions to make really data-driven decisions. Letting any one view of the portfolio guide your thinking, I think, is risky, and that's why I don't like Swiss Army knives. If you go to the next one, I guess
looks like time for a poll. Yeah. So
okay.
I think, Henry, some of your executives were a little startled with how many really were the small projects, and some of them really were strategic, but some of them kind of weren't. And so this is an obvious place where companies can get a lot of benefit. Many folks mentioned clutter at the beginning. So let's just do a quick poll. If you think about your portfolio, how many projects in your portfolio do you think are really too small to matter? So almost none, less than 10%, a few, 10 to 30%, many, 30 to 50%, or far too many, greater than 50%. And I can see about half of you have voted, and the votes are still coming in. So we'll just give it another 5 or 10 seconds here. About 2/3 of you have voted now. Looks like there aren't many votes. So last opportunity here. I'm going to close them in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and let's see the results here. Only 7% said almost none. 30% approximately are in the a few, 10 to 30%. Wow, 57% are in the 30 to 50% of projects are too small to matter. I mean, that just strikes me as a massive opportunity to for strategic portfolio management, and 7% of you are on far too many. Again, more opportunity there. So this seems to be a pretty common issue. And Henry, you want any comments on this or thoughts?
So first of all, I feel great that we're not alone. And in our portfolio, in round numbers, we went after the growth portfolio, and recognizing that there's some fraction of our spend that's necessary just to continue to meet regulatory filings and keep the business running. And when you look at the growth portfolio, we ended up stopping or shelving about 1/3 of the programs. So wow, pretty consistent with a lot of you, and yeah, it did shock a lot of our people, and that was one of the things we were worried about, because a lot of those programs were somebody's pet project, and when you go in and say, hey, I don't really think that's worth doing, and you haven't prepared the people with how you're going through it, and and presenting them with the data and letting them reach that conclusion and telling you that answer, I think you run into a lot of problems with zombie programs that have a life of their own, or guerrilla efforts that won't disappear. So anyway, it makes me feel better, and also I think the approach really can be helpful to you too.
Great, thank you. A reminder again to everybody, type in some questions. We have several. They're cultural questions, so they could have complex answers, so I'm going to defer them to the end so we don't derail Henry's story, but we will get to them in the Q&A at the end. And again, an invitation, type in more questions if you have them, and we'll deal with them as we can. So with that, let me move on to the next slide. All right, take it away, Henry.
Yeah, so another view that the Navigator gives us is called the CFO chart, which is a cumulative net present value along the y-axis versus the cumulative cost of completing projects on the x-axis. And what you can see is each project is represented by a line with a ball at the end of it, or as David likes to refer to them, lollipops. And in the starting portfolio, you can see that Pareto was exactly right. About 80% of the value, expected value of our portfolio was being delivered by about 20% of the resources. Now, for exactly the reasons that I just articulated, it would be the wrong thing to just start at the far right and say, let's just stop a third of those programs and either cash them in and save the money or reinvest it in some of the things on the left. But the right answer was to actually start at that end and go through all of the projects and say, is this really a productive use of our resources with all of the insights that we had gained. If you go to the next one, another view that's pretty common and easily understood, I think, is the risk-reward plot. And here, the probability of success of the projects are listed on the are shown on the y-axis, and the market-adjusted NPV along the x-axis. And in the upper left, you can see projects that are pretty easy because they're high probability of success, but they're probably not going to move the needle a lot on the business. Maybe some of them, for reasons we talked about, need to be done, but they're not going to be what's going to transform or lead growth in your portfolio. We call those bread and butter projects. If we had any in the upper right quadrant, which are really easy and can truly transform the business, they would be called pearls. We do have some in the lower right quadrant. We started with some in the lower right quadrant that you can see are really hard, and so most of them are going to fail. But if even one of them comes through, it could dramatically change the profile of the business. And we call those oysters. And the hope is that, yeah, a lot of them are going to fail, or a lot of them aren't going to meet all their proof points, but they might allow you to pivot to something that will still be very material to the business. And that's a long-winded way of saying that maybe some of these oysters will generate some pearls as you solve the technical problems and increase the probability of success. The other quadrant, the lower left, are things that are really hard, and yet even if we manage to pull them off, they're not going to make a hill of beans difference to this business. And unfortunately, you can see we had quite a few of them in this particular line of business. And you might say, well, why is that? And I don't really want to analyze it too much, other than to say our history is one of solving incredibly tough technical problems and not necessarily asking the question of should we. And so the real challenge here was to thin out the bread and butter so we could invest more in the oysters and kill the white elephants so we could do the same thing. And you can also see on the right-hand plot that we've pulled one of the white elephants into the oyster category. That was the one that I talked to you about in terms of finding the upside in the project and going after something that actually both had higher probability of delivering something and materially much larger in terms of its potential impact. So again, another important view of the portfolio. And I want to, if you go to the next one, point out that what we did in terms of the process was we started looking at all of these different dimensions of the projects and saying which ones can have the impact we want on the portfolio. And we started staffing projects by the resources that we had. We started staffing them for success as defined by the project teams. And you can see on the left that we didn't have enough R&D resources, and especially enough marketing resources in this particular example, this line of business's portfolio, in order to staff these programs for success. And so we ended up staffing substantially fewer than we started with, but we did staff them for success. And so we brought their probability up, and we brought their execution time down. And you can see from a survey result that we did after all of this was done, that we managed to keep the organization with us, that after we did this, 75% of the people agreed that we had decluttered the portfolio, and less than 10% said, yeah, they don't agree or they don't know. So I look at that and say that's a magnificent victory, that we made major change to the portfolio, and yet we had everybody, including the champions of these projects, saying, yeah, that's the right thing to do. If you go to the next one, it's just a look at the whole portfolio for safety and construction after the decision meetings, and it continues to evolve really on a monthly basis as programs come and go in the portfolio as they either graduate or die and new ones come in. You might ask, why do you still have so many white elephants? And that's really because what we have started to do is initiate dedicated scouting, and we've implemented some additional brainstorming tools, including crowdsourcing approaches from Imaginatic. But what we've done is said, okay, before we staff any of those, we're going to put them through something we call a learning machine methodology, where we pair together a commercial expert and a technical expert, and their job for the next 100 days is to go conduct 100 interviews with customers, suppliers, with people throughout the entire supply chain and market space to try and validate the value proposition and to find upside in these ideas. And what we are finding is that 80 to 90% of the things that we bring in don't make that cut, and we end up stopping them before they really become a meaningful part of the portfolio. And I've had a lot of business leaders come to me and say, well, that's terrible. Why don't we have better ideas? And my response to them is, yeah, we ought to be working on better ideas, generating better ideas, and that's what we're doing with some of the new methodologies. But I look at this also as a tremendous victory, because what we've really done is we have, in 100 days, killed 80 to 90% of the things that are bad ideas, bad projects, before we ever staffed them and went after them with vigor in terms of the R&D portfolio. So again, something that we found really successful for us. And when you add it all together, you see the next chart just shows what I call the virtuous cycle, where you start with strategy, you develop a complementary technology strategy where you can outline the where to play and how to win dimensions and elaborate them on technology roadmaps like the one that's shown on the left, and use that to make sure you have vibrant and vital and flowing pipelines in all of the things you said are really important, and then look at them from the point of view of should you be doing all those things, and will the portfolio meet your aspirations? And I'm happy to say that after we've done all of this work, 80%, I should say 4 of the 5 lines of business found that they went from not being able to meet the aspirations of a growth company to being able to address those, to be able to meaningfully address those challenges and be able to meet their growth aspirations. And the 5th one is coming up the lane fast. If you go to the next one, and I should also add that if you find that something won't meet your growth aspirations, you have to go back and ask, okay, do I need to change where I'm going to play or modify how I'm going to win? Do I need to spend more? Do I need to take more risks? So there are lots of ways you can address it. But if you look at this chart that David's got up, SmartOrg did some Monte Carlo simulations of the portfolio we started with and the one that we have now. And what you can see is that by looking for the hidden upside across the portfolio, by decluttering our portfolio and staffing projects for success, we didn't just make I think Stuart said a 30 to 50% improvement in the portfolio value. We made about a 2x improvement in the portfolio value. So really material for us, and something that I believe has fundamentally changed the perspective of the business. In fact, if you go to the next one, we spend about 80% of the resources on the bread and butter programs on the left and 20% on the high risk, high return oyster farm. And yet the expected value, despite the higher risk of the oysters, the expected value of the two parts of the portfolio are about the same today. And in fact, when you look and say, if some of the upside comes through, all of the upside is associated with those high risk, high return programs. Not only could these businesses meet their aspirations, but they could substantially exceed that. And so then the questions are coming back around the strategy. Are we being bold enough with our aspirations? And I think that's a wonderful discussion for the businesses to be having. The next chart just shows a little bit more about how we went through and did a survey. Again, we got SmartOrg's help here, so we would not be talking to ourselves, and did both an online survey, got about 80% return, 95 results there, and then we did we had them do about 35 face-to-face interviews. And the bottom line is that across all of the lines of business, across all of the functions, the results were uniformly positive in terms of the kinds of changes that we'd made, the significance, the feeling that we were on the right track, despite the fact that we had made such profound changes to the portfolios. And if you look at the next chart, you'll see that we did get some comments like what went well, the output's been good, seeing growth opportunities, able to make decisions we've been avoiding. Pointed out that some things like our new ventures, we need to go through the learning machine before we waste a lot of time inventing numbers to go into a project value calculation. We also got this lesson through that oysters are crucial to our growth, and we need to improve how we manage them. I think that, to me, that's worth its weight in gold. And what still puzzles us, how do we basically maintain the gain? So I couldn't be more pleased with what we ended up doing. But of course, that's only part of it. I started out telling you we have to make the right choices and then execute impeccably. If you go to the next chart, I don't want to ignore execution, but frankly, the reason I focused on this rather than execution today was because we've had lots of consultants come in and they look at us and evaluate us and they say, man, you guys execute like the guillotines in the French Revolution. That's not your problem. The problem is you've got to give people the better things to work on. So if you go to the next one, we really are continuing to try and improve how we execute across the entire R&D space, from lab management to R&D tools, to even debottlenecking what we think is already, and what consultants tell us is already, a world-class application development engine. But the most important impact we've made on R&D productivity is by working on the right things. So it sounds simple, but it obviously was a lot of work for us. If you go to the next one, we do have tools, again, that we continue to refine. I mentioned around ideation, we're now dedicating resources to scouting and keeping the pipeline flowing from the feeding the pipeline up front through being diligent about stopping things when they're not going to work. We've added the learning machine methodology and the rigor that I talked about before. We'll staff anything with R&D resources. We do have actually 3 stage gate systems that we use depending upon how complicated a project is, and we started to add Scrum methodologies for programs where we think that that's a really good system to accelerate development. So we've got lots of things going on in that part of the view. But if you'll indulge me with one last chart, and I apologize for rambling on a bit. This is from my experience with more than 30 years of R&D management, which is the keys to success, I think, are finding the best people, because they're really your differentiator, and then recognizing that the biggest breakthroughs often come at the intersection of disciplines. That's hard, but it's significant. And so get the best and brightest and then listen to them and learn from them, but carefully choose the right problems. Then you can execute impeccably. If you're given the best and brightest anything but the best projects, you're really wasting your talent. And then finally, you can get a lot of consultants that'll tell you make better choices, execute impeccably. That's not rocket science in terms of advice. It's obviously a lot of hard work to get it done. But for me, the thing that sometimes gets lost is the role of courage and judgment. And what I've got at the top of this chart is a cartoon, but I assure you that all of the elements are real, and that over my 38 years, I've collected examples from a number of DuPont's most significant product launches. And I can assure you that our biggest blockbusters have typically gone through between 2 and 3 near-death experiences. Projects go through stages of despair to euphoria, depending upon the macro environment, depending upon sometimes false data that comes through, or something that was missing, or a whole variety of customer input. And you need to dream big and don't be afraid to fail. That's in good standing with the risk. But also don't throw in the towel at the first sign of a technical challenge, because really solving those problems is really what can differentiate you from your competition and put you on a different level. So I think there's one more chart, but that's really the end of my remarks at this point. I think we feel really good about the business's portfolio, as well as the processes that are now in place to sustain the gains, and getting into our own rhythm to do that has been hard work, but now it's up to our shareholders to decide which lane they want to take. So, David, back to you.
Great, thank you. Well, we have a lot of good questions. In the interest of time, I want to just tell you about some next steps, and then we'll come back to questions and answer them as long as there's interest in that, so that those of you who want to go can go, and then we'll come back to this. So let me defer this for a moment. Just in terms of next steps, you can either put more questions in the question register and we'll get to them. And if you have questions afterwards, you can send them to Stuart there at smartorg.com, and we'll be happy to continue the conversation there. We'll also have a recording of this and the Q&A session here, so you can get that there. Do visit smartorg.com to connect and stay informed. 2 things of interest. The webinar replay will be available soon. We also do a monthly newsletter. Indeed, we'll be writing up this story, so you can subscribe to Value Point. And if you want to follow us to get another sense, you can find us on LinkedIn or on Twitter there at SmartOrg Inc. So I think that ends the formal part of this. So if you need to go, so feel free, of course. But I'm going to return now to Q&A and work through some of the questions, of which there are many, and we'll go in probably another 5 or 10 minutes or so until things wane. So thank you very much, and I'm going to turn to Q&A here. So with me and Henry. So Henry, there are a cluster of questions. I'm going to sort of lump them together, having to do with culture. And these I think a couple examples come from Mike and Jim. So one, I'm going to put them together and then you can just sort of comment. So one is, this is Mike, any suggestions on how to overcome a culture that is stuck in a reactive product strategy? How can it be moved to more of a growth thinking strategy driven by innovation? And then Jim asks, I think, a sort of version of that question, how do you change a culture to tolerate the fail of projects, or even encouraging earlier failure so ideas can be explored quickly to find the big winners without punishing the explorers? So could you comment on culture change, Henry?
Yeah, culture change is really hard, and what was it Drucker said, culture eats portfolio for breakfast or something. So it really is, I think it's actually a strategy for breakfast. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. Anyway, the bottom line is, that is something that we've worried about, and our approach to it is, I think, somewhat in keeping with our overall culture. One is that we really have spent a lot of time overtly by the senior business leaders of actually the new DuPont, as well as each of the businesses, focusing on culture change and doing some of those things that you guys alluded to in terms of recognizing teams that had made data-driven decisions, had failed fast, had taken risks, prudent risks, and celebrated both learnings as well as successes. And learnings might imply that things weren't a total success from the business point of view, at least from the expectation point of view, but ultimately we learned enough from it so that we'll be smarter next time, and it might have allowed us to pivot into another direction. But it absolutely is one of the hardest things, and one of the things I tried to highlight, but probably didn't do it well enough throughout the talk, is highlight how we tried to educate people and tried to be very transparent with the data, so that people felt that they got a fair shake, their project got a fair shake, even if the ultimate decision wasn't to go forward with it. And in a lot of cases, it was really gratifying to see people who were champions of a project saying, yeah, I can see that this is a better alternative, and I have enough confidence in the process and how we calibrated between projects that this really is the right thing to do. And so I was very pleased by that. I also think one of the mindset changes we had was to focus on proof points rather than on mindlessly is a bad word, rather than on diligently following stage gate protocols, by looking at the proof points, which are really tied to the business models in the Portfolio Navigator. That allowed us to add a new dimension to project management by saying, let's go after the killer question first, even if we normally wouldn't get to that until stage 4 or 5 in stage gate management. So I think there were a number of things that we tried to do from the mechanics, but it really was highlighting for people the importance of getting decisions made more quickly, even if they were imperfect, and that as long as we made data-driven decisions, even if we made some mistakes, we were going to be way better off than we were before.
Great. Thank you. Let me make another addition on the cultural side. When people think about portfolio processes, they often think about the data and the dashboards, and all of that's good. But I also find when you want to change something, it's equally important to think of portfolio management as from a social point of view, as a conflict resolution process. And I have what I call the golden rule, which is, and you mentioned this in your answer here, which is you want to design your portfolio process so the political loser can actually come to the same conclusion themselves. So if they're just embattled, then you kind of increase the conflict. But if you invite people to look at the evidence and come to their own conclusions, it's actually startling how often people realize that that theirs isn't the best option, and they actually don't want to work on it anymore. So that can be important in cultural change. So let me move on to the next question cluster. I think I'd characterize this one as sort of, how do you get started? Let me give you a couple examples. So Diane says, you've described the results of what was obviously a large effort. Did you just start that way, or did you tee it up somehow? How did you get things moving? And Frank wants to know about the path. Did you do pilots, or did you just go for it? Similar version of the same question. And James asks that you mentioned the portfolio game. Did you start with education and do the game and then build this up, or did you do some examples and cases first? But I think all these questions are in the space of how do you get this started. So please comment.
Yeah, so we actually relied on SmartOrg that's done this lots of times before to help us. And as I told you, I had a different vision of how this was going to proceed, and we did start with the first wave of some key leaders, and including our growth champions being trained, and they came back and told me, yeah, you're wrong about your assumptions. We need to change directions here, and we need to both get help and get leadership training. But it did take some senior leadership buy-in first, and explaining what we could expect and what they should hold me accountable for through this process was part of that. Training the senior leaders, including our business president and our line of business leaders, each in in portfolio math, if you will, with the portfolio game. Turned out to be something that I hadn't anticipated was going to be so important. And then I really was launching into this line of business by line of business. And so you can look at it and say, well, DuPont started with us, and maybe we had among the broadest journey to go. And we're now seeing other parts of the business adopting, other parts of the new DuPont adopting the same process. But that's essentially how we got started. It was through a recognition that we had worked on strategy and that we had developed our roadmaps, but they were not sufficient to meet our aspirations, and that we were frustrated and not able to get what we needed from our mother of all spreadsheets exercise that really drove us to doing something better. So yeah, I don't know if that's satisfactory.
Yeah, I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that. I do recall, there were some you had us. I think you had me keynoted at like an annual leadership meeting and just give a kind of 45-minute talk, if I recall, and we had worked with the growth leaders. And so there was an awareness building step. We had some people doing some examples with the growth leaders, but I also recall there were a lot of voices who said, yeah, we already do portfolio management. And and you had to sort of show them that this was really radically different, if I recall. And I wonder if you could just sort of comment on those elements.
Yeah, again, what I tried to do is bring data. So when we had projects fail and we would do diagnostics, or when we would dig into the portfolio, and again, the mother of all spreadsheets is not something you can dig into easily, but you can pick little examples, not little. You can pick examples out of it and highlight for people the problems. And I think that was part of convincing them we needed to do a better job. That we had limited resources and we needed to do more with those resources, and therefore this was absolutely essential if we were going to get where we needed to go. I think that was helpful. I think David talking at a senior leadership meeting, showing them that there was a better way to go, and basically the leadership team holding me accountable and to do this, but then me making sure that at every checkpoint we had all of the business leaders participating in this whole process, so that this was transparent and inclusive and not an R&D exercise, I think was really critical to success. And I think the biggest problem would be if your business leaders don't believe that you have a problem and you see it. And I think then you're going to have to start with, don't you think we could be doing better with our investments? If you look at our portfolio, would your 401k ever be structured this way? Are you happy with the risks that we're taking? Are you happy with the returns? We think we can get better returns, and showing some promise of how that's happened by prudent portfolio management, I think might be ways of getting started. But largely, if you've got good strategy work done, and then you've looked at your roadmaps, I think that in many cases can convince people that what we got isn't enough to meet the aspirations, and so we've got to do something different.
Yeah, I think that really rings true. I think when I talk to folks, a lot of people come to SmartOrg and say, we want a better portfolio process, and they're sort of in the zone of best practices. And just reflecting on your comments, it does seem to me that connecting it to a real business problem, usually around growth or a fear that we won't hit our growth or that we could make much more growth or something like that, you got to start with the business problem and really demonstrate that the momentum path has a high probability of not getting you where you want to go. And then you sort of fill in the practices for the portfolio through that. So that idea of building up the problem and the business issue that the portfolio and service of very, very much rings true in my experience.
Yeah, and sadly, we're probably more responsive. We're probably more responsive to fear than greed.
Indeed.
So, some comment of the combination of the carrot and the stick can help. And, the technical group is not any different here. I think one of the best things we did for the technology organization was show them that when I say we stopped 35% of what we had going, that's very true. Some of those projects went on the shelf, and we said we'll get back to them when and if we have resources and they're the best thing that we have to work on. So now we have actually a bench of stuff, and that helps people get more confidence that if their project ends, they're not going to be terminated. Because I think there was an unconscious bias that could happen, and so therefore I ought to keep working on this project no matter what, and I ought to avoid the killer experiment because it could really kill me, kind of thing. So we had those elements of the culture too to deal with.
Yeah. Great, thank you. There's still a lot of people on the webinar. And there are, I think, 2 more clusters. So if we have another few minutes, let me sort of group some questions here into clusters. This next cluster, I think, has to do with planning or the relationship with project management or finance. And let me give you a few examples. Julie says, the long-range plan and finance want a scenario that's a commitment. They want to see the spreadsheet, the P&L, and you took a different approach. How do you deal with that? Alex asks, says, bringing uncertainty into planning seems tough. What are your tips? And Peter asks about accountability. Like, you're showing scenarios and tornado diagrams. How do you get accountability? And also, where are the project milestones and the delivery? So all those in the space of sort of what's the relationship between planning or sort of financial roll-ups, long-range plans, and so on. So what are your comments on that cluster?
I can understand the questions. I'm not sure how to start. I would say that our finance leaders got this pretty quickly. Our business, actually basically all of our organization got it pretty quickly when you compared our investment portfolio and innovation, which by the way is not all R&D, but when we compared that to our own personal 401ks and the fact that some of the lines of business had all their money not just in T-bills but stuffed in the mattress rather than putting it to work on some things that were risky, and getting people comfortable with the fact that in all of our 401ks you could identify pieces that went up and down. You didn't end up with only selecting winners, and that was in itself a way to manage risk. That you'd be going after some combination of things to spread the risk and improve the overall return. I think that kind of analogy helped a lot of people, and I think this stupid dice game. I'm sorry, Dave. This insightful dice game. It reinforced that with people, and David makes it interesting by actually making them give up. What is it? You make them give up? Is it $3? $5
to play.
$5 to play, and they get 10 each, I guess, right? If they beat a certain modest spread that's represented by incremental portfolio, and so. Turning $5 into 10 somehow cemented that for people that make a very good living. That still cemented a lesson that I thought should have been ingrained in all of them. So that helped. But the whole point about ultimate accountability is a really good one. I can be held accountable, and I am held accountable for the value of the portfolio over time, and also for how we're returning on the R&D investment that we're making. How much are we getting out for how much we're putting in, and we measure all that in terms of new and improved products and process revenues. So we've got that, and we can see the value of the portfolio going. But I mean, you could say I'm taking a risk because I'm being held accountable for delivering on this approach, but I look at it and it's the surest bet that I can see, and when I look at the things that we stopped, it's absolutely clear they were never going to have an impact. And so even people that say, but how can you be sure? You can bring up the third of the things that you're stopping and saying, well, I can tell you that because we're not wasting our time on these. And we went from having, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, but hey, we're being candid here. We went from having people working on an average of 3 to 4 things to working on no more than 2. And don't you think, that all the studies that have gone into human productivity show that people can't focus really on more than a couple of things at once. So how can you not believe that this is going to deliver what you expect? But it does require that you take some personal risk as well. And as again, I look at it as a prudent one because the alternative is stupid. So
yeah, it's like you're saying in a way that people have to understand that that a more uncertainty portfolio can actually be more reliable at the portfolio level, so that the chance of them hitting their goals actually goes up.
Yeah.
Right.
And the challenge, of course, is with the scientists at the bench saying, well, okay, you're asking me to work on higher risk things, but also be accountable for results and impact rather than just a list of activities. And that's, another whole cultural discussion that we can have. But again, I think when they see and can vote with their feet on what to work on in terms of potential value, and they see that we're staffing for success, and we're doing the market work up front, and all of the things that maybe they didn't have in the past. I think that really helps people get on board with that.
Yeah, I know some organizations have a somewhat a difficult relationship sometimes with finance. In particular, you find people who they want to see the financials laid out, and they want the precision of filling in year by year, cell by cell. Tell me exactly how much of this we're going to get in year 4 and 5, and there's a kind of energy around that. Maybe they want to roll it up for a long-range plan or for a report to the street or something, but there's a lot of focus on really massaging the financials of a single thing that is definitely a different kind of energy. Did you encounter much of that?
So I would say, in general, our finance people were pretty good with that. And maybe the reason is because there's an intense focus on the next, call it 4 to 6 quarters. And this is really a complementary view of sort of the next 4 to 6 years. And it's I think, David, you've pointed out to me many times that at this level, the accuracy of our project management processes for what's going to happen in the next 18 months is much better than necessarily the precision of what's in SmartOrg, where the average lifetime of projects is longer than that. So using that data for the short term and using the portfolio view for the longer term, I think has resonated with a lot of people. I don't know if that helps or not. And certainly we do expect project managers for the shorter things that are coming in the next 18 months to be continually updating things. But for the bulk of the oysters, which is where a lot of that value comes in, they're not going to be hitting in the next 18 months. So we see a lot of churn there, and I think just being upfront about that's what you ought to expect when you have something that's a 25% probability of success. Get over it. I think as long as you're transparent about how you've been approaching the proof points and what you've been doing when you don't hit a proof point, I think being transparent about what you're starting and stopping is all part of it, and that I think gains some credibility. But the finance people haven't been the hardest nuts in this. It's largely been some of the sales and marketing folks who are saying, but my customer really needs this tiny tweak on something, and convincing the business leadership that is insignificant compared with the bigger picture, and we can either work on 1,000 of those little things that'll give us $100 kind of impact, or we can work on 10 things that'll give us 1,000, is the discussion you have to have.
Great, great. Well, thank you. I think we better move to final remarks and calling it. So just a few quick reminders here. Again, the next steps and follow-up questions to Stuart there. Visit the website to get the webinar replay and sign up. If you like this sort of content, sign up for our monthly Value Point newsletter. And if you want to follow us on Twitter at SmartOrg Inc. or on LinkedIn is right there. With that, Henry, do you have any final words for our audience?
Well, so I feel a little bad that I rambled on so much that you didn't get it. Everybody didn't get a chance to ask all the questions individually, and again, if I didn't answer your question to your satisfaction, by all means, let Stuart know, and I will try and follow up as well as I know SmartOrg will on anything that I can help with. So appreciate the opportunity to talk, and if there's something I can do for you, just let me know.
Great. Well, Henry, thank you so much. Those remaining, again, thanks for hanging on, and it's been a great, so thanks again, and thank you so much, and that concludes the webinar. All right, take care.